Howdy folks, Shell Presto DiBaggio here. Today I've got a real treat for you because I'm doing fully rendered pen work, which I haven't done since Inktober. I'm also having a throwback moment here because it's straight up medieval fantasy art. And barring one piece of Record of Lodoss War fan art, I don't think I've drawn a polished piece of fantasy art, medieval fantasy art, in 7 years or so, I think. Sure, I draw fantasy and sci-fi art all the time. The Ascension Epoch is rich in those resources. Our books have magic and swords and sorcerers and living armor and all sorts of monsters. But they're mostly set in the late 1800s at the earliest. There is some ancient Rome stuff with Dart, but that overshoots medieval Europe and goes way too far back. But my love for medieval fantasy runs deep, going all the way back to my early childhood. The Dungeons and Dragons cartoon debuted the year I was born, so I only saw it as reruns sporadically growing up. But oh, how I loved it. And remember that awesome wizard Presto? He was my favorite character on the show, so of course... No, that's not true. He was my favorite character, but has nothing to do with my nickname. I like to think he does, though. I loved old NES games like The Immortal and Swords and Serpents and Final Fantasy and, drumroll please, Phantasy Star. I always saw D&D ads in Marvel Comics, too. And then, of course, as I got a little older, there was Record of Lodoss War and Slayers and the Dungeons and Dragons arcade games. But D&D proper, as a tabletop role-playing game, eluded me until I was 15. You see, the internet was young back in those days, so you couldn't use it to find other players very easily, and you definitely couldn't watch some celebrities or some cool indie cats like authors Richard Rowland and Ben Feehan sit around the table and play RPGs. There was a thing called buffering back in the day, and because of it, even if you were just streaming a video and not downloading it, you probably had to just leave it up on your screen and wait a day to come back and watch a 5-minute segment, because otherwise the buffering was real. But you actually had to know people in real life who wanted to play back in those days. And if you didn't know anyone, you had to find people. And if no one knew how to play, you had to suck it up and plunk down $30 apiece for the 3 manuals needed to get a game going. And let me tell you, $90 was no small investment, and you had no idea if you were going to like playing before you started playing. I was fortunate enough that one of my friends already played back then. And here's the most important part of getting a game together. He wanted to be the Dungeonmaster. If you want to play D&D or any RPG, you should just be the Dungeon Master or the Game Master. If none of your friends already play, and you don't suck it up and take on the Dungeon Master role, you ain't playing. Now, the Dungeon Master, or Game Master if you're playing anything other than D&D or a fantasy game, and there are a lot of options besides D&D with a lot of different settings and time periods. The Dungeon Master has to do all the work. You'll probably end up putting at least an hour or 2 of legwork into figuring out what in general you'll present to the players for that session. Note that I didn't say figuring out what will happen in that session. You don't get to know what will happen that session. The characters can end up doing anything. You just sort of have to hope they're a good group and will go through the adventure in a way that gels with your plans and what you had set up in terms of, setting and monsters and plot points and everything like that. If that sounds daunting, though, there are adventure books and adventure modules. I recently picked up and started playing through a really cool dungeon in a setting called Basic Fantasy. There's a really nice starter adventure. There's no story, that's up to the player characters and the Dungeon Master to figure out. But it gives you a dungeon maze and all the monsters and traps, and once you give the party an incentive to get there, well, you're playing. And there's lots of adventures and modules like that for a lot of different games, and they're very handy for starting. Or if you have a campaign or story going for your player characters already, and you're just looking for some new ideas here and there to throw into this week's adventure, you can check out magazines like Bexim's Bazaar that have fresh ideas that you can add to games like random tables and uh, quick dungeons and all sorts of good stuff like that. I bring up Bexim's Bazaar specifically because this art will be appearing in issue number 3, and I should be doing more awesome old-school RPG style art like this for them in future months. It's a fun magazine with a focus on building terrain and painting miniatures, which are also really nice to have on your table to get that full immersive experience. And it scratches the itch that Dungeon and Dragon, not Dungeons and Dragons, but two separate things, Dungeon and also Dragon magazine left when they stopped printing. I'll leave a link to Drive-Thru RPG where you can purchase digital copies in the description. And in case you were wondering, yes, my husband and I do make miniature wargaming terrain and RPG terrain together as well. So if you guys want to see a video that shows some of that, it wouldn't be step by step, but yeah, just let me know. Although this is going to stay predominantly a drawing and painting channel no matter what, because I don't do that much terrain. Okay, so what am I drawing here? Well, I have too many characters to not use them, so this is officially a Bat Country Ascension Epoch drawing. We call anything that's so out of the realm of what happens to our characters in canon Bat Country. In the regular Ascension Epoch, Ruby Faraday is a half-fairy investigator for the Institute for Metaphysical and Phenomenological Studies, or, more compactly, IMPS, a small paranormal research group headquartered in New Jersey. However, in medieval fantasy Ascension Epoch, IMPS is a small group of monster collectors or exterminators focused on trying to create a complete monster manual, both for the curiosity of Ruby's father and to help other adventurers and townspeople deal with the unknown. Ruby here is still half-fae, of course, because that just fits in with the medieval fantasy perfectly. But she does have pointy ears in this version, because someone in the party has to have the pointed elf ear trope. Ruby's class is sorceress, and while she may have a couple spells up her sleeve like detect magic and the like, elementally she can only use fire spells. Her mother was a fire fairy specifically. Technically, she doesn't even need to use a spell to summon fire. It's just an innate ability. She can't, however, put out fires, so whatever she starts has to burn out by itself, or be put out, or, cause major problems for the party, because fire isn't something to start lightly or mess around with. In this image, she's wandering through a wizard's dungeon, looking to deal with a cockatrice problem. She's found a petrified soldier who previously went in to deal with the problem, but there's still no sign of the little beasties. Or is there? I tried to go with a style like the really old black and white monster manual, or all the old GURPS books. That's Steve Jackson's generic universal role-playing system, or Palladium's RPG books. So that meant a lot of pen work. I could have, and wanted to, use screentones, but there's a bit of math to be done when you use dot matrix screentones. That's a fancy way of saying all the shading is done with tiny dots to get a feeling of gray. And since I wasn't the one printing the magazine, I didn't want to complicate things by having to know the DPI of the format or saying, you can't resize this image to the publisher. So I did all the shading just with my Micron fineliner pens and a Pentel brush pen. And let me tell you, it was a tad nerve-wracking. Not the actual inking. I'm pretty confident with that. But I use, and I like to recommend using, erasable colored pencils for my pencil work when I know I'm going to ink something. Y is a whole other issue for another video. But even erasable colored pencils are a little waxy compared to the gray graphite in a regular drawing or number 2 pencil. And that little bit of waxiness can be hard on fineliner tips. Brushes don't seem affected by it, and if you're using a dip pen, you can wipe off the nib. But my Micron and Copic fineliners, especially the smallest ones, don't last as long when I use colored erasable pencils. The colored pencils are still worth it to me in the long run because it just makes seeing my lines easier and makes inking go faster. So I'm still obviously going to use them, but it's important to note that it's hard on the pens. I got this drawing finished with a day to spare, but when I started this drawing, when I started inking this drawing, I only had one working .005 micron pen, and those are the nibs most likely to go on me. The .005 nibs are temperamental even without the slightly waxier graphite, or pencil. I'm sure it's not actually graphite in there. Anyway, even without the slightly waxier pencil. So I'm sitting there inking after the local art supply store is closed, hoping nothing goes wrong with my pen, and wiping off the tip with a tissue constantly. It was fun times. I've since bought 2 more .005 pens, so I don't have to sweat it next time. Even if I'm not on a deadline, having to stop drawing when you want to because you don't have a backup supply isn't fun. So always try to have an extra necessary pen or necessary size brush in your inventory, folks. Especially when they're the small ones that are a bit touchier. If it's hard to tell, I'm using thicker pens on the wall the further I get back from the flame to do that fade into black effect. On the other hand, I'm using the smallest pens, the .005 and the .01, on the cockatrices because they're in the background, but still well lit. Another tip from this drawing. You'll notice that I put in perspective lines for the stones in the background. Now, this is faux medieval architecture using rocks, so these rock walls shouldn't appear even or have conformity. However, if you want a real sense of depth, you still have to use some perspective. So I adhere loosely to those perspective lines when I draw the rocks. I curve and bend the lines here and there subtly to preserve the look of natural materials, but it's those perspective lines that make it look like Ruby is walking down a cavernous hallway towards us. My apologies to everyone who wants to draw old dungeon walls hoping they won't have to pull out a ruler. I used to be one of you, and the truth is a harsh mistress. By the way, cockatrices are little cursed chicken lizards that can either kill or turn victims to stone with a glance or a touch, depending on where you're getting your folklore from. They're a popular myth in old Europe, specifically England, and are often confused or lumped together with basilisks, which Harry Potter fans will be familiar with. Okay, so I promised you folks Ruby Faraday's mom's unnerving origin story. This is a modern-day Ascension Epoch story, but with a little tweaking it would still apply to the mother of our fantasy heroine here. Like most good paranormal detective stories, the tale of imps hinges on a weary scholar poring over ancient and dusty tomes. Here are the words of IMP's founder, S. Maxwell Faraday, then a librarian working for the Houdini Center for the Prevention of Paranormal Crime, describing his eureka moment. Quote, I was working late one June night at the Percivant Memorial Library, converting an old parchment booklet by Pseudo-Agrippa into electronic format. We had to do it by hand because the paper was so delicate, and because the script was so faded we had to fix a lot of errors in the scan. It was very painstaking and tedious. By 8 o'clock, I had been working 13 hours. I was hungry, my eyes hurt, and I was about to give up and go home. But then a part in the passage I was correcting about Fae consciousness reminded me of something I read a long time ago in Cardan's De Subtilitate, and then I got to thinking about the both of them in a device on the order of the electric pentagram. And that's pretty much how I came up with the Mark I ultra-terrestrial restraining charm. Perfectly obvious, right? Sure, but only in hindsight. End quote. Quite. What Faraday had come up with was an idea for a collar that would subject humanoid ultra-terrestrial entities, that is, fairies, to mind control. The nature and motivation of the Fae were then, as they are now, little understood. However, since the 1917 Cottingley sightings, the Houdini Center had been convinced of an underlying truth behind the classical tales of encounters with strange, otherworldly humanoids, stories that spanned every culture and every time period and held remarkable similarities. Harry Houdini actually led the watershed 1917 Cottingley investigation, assuming the event was fraud perpetuated by malicious mediums. Specific data collected during the investigation disproved this hypothesis, and although egregore theory was only embryonic at this point, the team's experience at Cottingley Beck seemed to contradict what was supposed at the time. Though privately Houdini remarked that he was very concerned by the encounter, the study of so-called fairy phenomena was given lower priority at the time to the more pressing concern of metahuman criminals. However, in 1969, the study of fairies would get a boost with Francois Lacombe's publication of The Magic Casement Opens. The book was a sweeping survey of thousands of strange encounters ranging from Near Eastern myth and medieval European fairy folklore to the rash of mystery airship sightings before the Martian invasion. Lacombe's assessment was taken very seriously within the Houdini Center and came to be called the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis. A standing project to study and neutralize fairies called Project Cold Iron was launched in 1971. For years, Cold Iron operatives aggressively pursued contact and elimination of fairies, and almost all of their missions ended in failure. Agents were often killed or disappeared, sometimes turning up days or even years later in far-off locations with foggy memories of their whereabouts. No captured Fae survived captivity long enough for study, and their body parts always disappeared mysteriously. When Faraday presented his research on the restraining collar in September of 1978, the center leadership was very skeptical. Faraday, however, was so confident that he enthusiastically offered to slap it on a Hugh with his own hands. 13 months later, he would get his chance in a forest not far from Cottingley. For weeks in the early autumn, there had been a series of mysterious forest fires near the Humber estuary in England. These appeared without warning and seemingly without cause, for there were never any accelerants found on the scene, and the weather was wet and with no lightning. The first few fires were extinguished without incident, but in the week before Halloween, fires were burning out of control and had claimed several structures as well as the lives of 2 firemen. At the same time, many local residents and firemen reported bizarre encounters with strange humanoid creatures. The encounters had many of the hallmarks of Lacombe's ultra-terrestrials. Consultants from the Houdini Center, including Faraday with a suitcase of his collars, arrived and made several attempts to ambush these dangerous fire elementals. True to his boast, Faraday collared not 1, but 3 Fae. His invention worked. Whether the remaining Fae were deterred by the unprecedented capture of their kin, or left for another reason, is not known. But there were no more encounters after Halloween, and the fire stopped as well. Faraday returned to New England with his 3 prisoners. Of the 3 captives, only one survived. The first specimen, a small, hairy goblin type, died without obvious cause when the plane was over the Atlantic. The second specimen, tall and slender and apparently male, who was found wearing strange metallic silver-type pajamas and a visor permanently fastened to his head, was accidentally killed during experimentation in 1980. The survivor was a statuesque female, found stark naked and wreathed in flame while setting fire to an orchard. Since the collar prevented her from utilizing her pyrokinetic talents except on command, she attempted to satisfy her fascination with fire through any source of open flame, from gas cooktops to blowtorches, and her favorite, matches. When not closely attended, she frequently attempted to set objects and even other people on fire, though she never seemed aware at the danger this presented. Her own skin and hair seemed immune to damage from combustion. The most frequent target of her incendiary urges were her clothes, which she loathed, preferring to go naked at all times. Though she spoke passable English, she seemed confused and alarmed when asked her name, and provided no answer. Initially referred to by the designation Hugh 18F, she eventually expressed a preference to be called Matches, because, as she said, they are fun to play with. When she was told that Matches was not an appropriate name, nor were they toys to be played with, she became temperamental, sometimes sticking her thumb in her mouth and blowing until she passed out. Various other normal human names were suggested to her, but her reaction was always the same. Not wanting to, quote, look weak by simply calling her what she wanted, the battle went on until Faraday suggested Madge, which could be short for Matches, he said. Surprisingly, she assented. Okay, good enough. Of the 3 fae, Madge was the most communicative, often expressing curiosity in the doings of her captors, particularly Faraday, with whom she was most in contact. She also stoutly resisted the collar's control, though she was never successful in breaking it, sometimes going into days-long periods of despondent silence when her attempts to resist Faraday's commands failed. And there you have it, folks. Madge matches Faraday's origin. Ruby makes her entrance not too long after that. She may only have half as much fire as her mother, but that's more than enough. This account, which was written by my husband, wasn't from one of our books, but if you like mildly unnerving fairy tales, you may also enjoy the one in Martian War Chronicles, Population of Loss. That book includes 4 short stories, 1 fairy tale, 2 steampunk short stories, and 1 Wild West tale. Also, although Ruby hasn't appeared in any of our books yet, she will appear in future East End Irregulars books. There are 2 books out in that series so far, and there is another red-headed fire starter already in that series to hold your interest, although she's much less likely to set someone on fire in a fit. And those books each have at least 1 illustration per chapter by yours truly. You can learn more on ascensionepoch.com, one word, no spaces, ascensionepoch.com, amazon.com, or other online bookstores. And of course, both physical and ebook purchases support the channel. And please don't forget to click that like button if you enjoyed this video. Also, please consider subscribing if you'd like to see more art videos from me. And don't be afraid to let me know if you liked this art, or have any art questions or RPG questions, or if you'd like to suggest future video topics for me to talk about in the comments below. And remember, I've got the Bexim's Bazaar link in the description too. Issue number 0 is free, by the way, and still pretty darn awesome, even though it doesn't have art by yours truly in it. Till next time, have an awesome day. Presto, over and out.
Alright guys, for this next room the map says to make sure you don't step on the 13th stone.
No problem.
Slag, are you listening? You can't step on the 13th stone in the next room.
Yeah, I got you. 13th stone. Don't step. Not a problem.
Certainly hope so. We wouldn't want a repeat of the last dungeon we were sent through.
Hey, that's harsh, man. Anyone could have set off those arrows.
Let's just try to get through this injury-free.
Well, that went well.
Indeed.
11, 12, 13. Hey guys, which stone am I not supposed to step on?
Oh no. Spiders!
Why would we get trapped in this room when he set off the trap in that room?
Guys, are you alright? I'm sorry.
Blast it! Wind to my aid!
Zahn, are you okay?
I was bitten. I need antitoxin.
I'm all out.
Me too. That means...
Oh shit. It's okay, Zahn. I'll open the door.
The map says if you set off the trap, look to the ceiling.
There's writing up there?
What does it say?
I can't read it.
Is it worn off?
It's in runic. I was never very good with runic.
I'm going to die because you couldn't pass your ancient scripts class.
Hey, I said I'll get you out. Okay. Oof.
Is he?
Trying to break down the wall.
Oof.
Slag, you're going to hurt yourself. Go get help.
I am going to break down this wall.
Slag! Zahn, hold on.
Damn it, Zahn.
I'm going to die from a spider bite.
I said I'll get you out.
Byron Nollis, he did it.
I told you I would. Here,